You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 25th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme... Jubilation in Uruguay as the centre-left candidate wins the election. We'll look at the agenda of the G7 foreign ministers meeting being held just outside Rome, and then...
Hello, Georgina. This is Chris Chermak. I'll be joining you to talk about Germany, the upcoming election, and why the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz will be running in that election despite historic levels of unpopularity.
Then we'll ask why Israel's oldest publication has been sanctioned by the state. And we'll find out why the first Algerian winner of France's premier literary award may be stripped of the prize. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. As the biggest year in global elections comes to an end, Uruguay has continued the trend of the incumbent party losing to the opposition. However, unlike other polls in the region, this vote has ended without rancour and sharp political divides between left and right. Centre-left opposition candidate Yamandú Orsi beat Conservative Álvaro Delgado, and the two moderates have expressed goodwill and promised to work together. Well, I'm joined now by Andrew Thompson, a journalist and political risk analyst specialising in Latin America. Andrew, thanks for coming on the show. What are the final figures for the results?
The final figures, or as close to, I think it's 99.9% of the votes counted, are 49.8% for Yamandú Orsi, the winner, and 45.9% for his opponent, centre-right, on the centre-right, Delgado.
And so how do these elections work? Does it matter that he's not got over 50?
No, it doesn't matter in terms of getting the presidency. It's the most voted of two. This is a second round runoff. What does matter, of course, is the alliance of forces in Congress, in the National Assembly, where Orsi will not have an outright majority. Members of his left-wing coalition will have 48 seats against 49 for the opposition. What that means is that there will have to be a lot of negotiation over anything he wants to do. You could see this as, typical case of democratic checks and balances.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Orsi.
Yes, I think the key word in describing Orsi is Canelones. He was born there, brought up there, and has been mayor of Canelones for 10 years, and it's regarded as a very successful period in power. He's also a professor of history, and he is basically known as someone who listens, quite shrewd politically, and is very good at negotiation, because with a large number of political parties, often in different coalitions and struggling to get control of a majority vote in Congress, you really do negotiating skills. You do need them, and Orsi will be basically tested on that for the next 5 years.
And how does his centre-left party differ from the Conservative Party of Delgado, and what were their major campaign issues?
I suppose the main difference is that Orsi would describe himself as a social democrat, a moderate social democrat, whereas the centre-right parties are much more, if you like, pro-business. They want Uruguay to become more competitive and more likely to cut social spending. But the key thing, I think, is that it's a question of degree. It's at the margins and incremental. So, typically pension reform is an issue. And there have been some changes, but there was also a plebiscite in the first round of elections which rejected a very radical pension reform that would cost a lot of money. And Orsi identifies himself with those who want to make change while at the same time maintaining Uruguay attractive to foreign investors. So I'd say the two key issues during the campaign were crime, public safety in far away the number one slot, and the economy in the number two slot. So crime will also be a big issue for the new government. And again, there isn't that drastic a difference, or there wasn't that drastic a difference between the two parties on crime. Uruguay is, seen from a Latin American point of view, it has low crime numbers and is a very safe place to live. Seen from within Uruguay, there is no doubt that crime has become worse than it was before. And for example, the homicide rate is now above 10 per 100,000, a level which the World Health Organization says is anything above 10 per 100,000 is sign of a pandemic of violence.
How has Uruguay managed to avoid the unpleasantness, the political unpleasantness that we've seen in elections in Argentina and Brazil and Mexico?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure if I've got a good answer. I think, first of all, that populist parties and the whole sort of thing of fake news and all that kind of syndrome that much of the world has experienced, much of the democratic world has experienced, has not really fully arrived in Uruguay. There is a party that is kind of populist on the right, but it has very little support. It may be that, among other explanations, is what I was saying earlier about how domestic politics is always about negotiation. And if it's always about negotiation, that goes against polarization and, very intense left-right disagreements. It may also be a case that Uruguay is, comparatively speaking, relatively affluent. So while the economy is an issue, and there are issues of income distribution and poverty and unemployment, it just seems to be a little bit more manageable. Argentina, on the other side of the River Plate, has been struggling with, 200% inflation. Uruguay thinks inflation is quite high at 6% per annum. So there is a kind of, I suppose the key thing is that the sense of a political establishment that doesn't listen to voters that you get in places like Argentina and Brazil and Mexico is less present in Uruguay for the moment. There's nothing, it's not guaranteed to be a civilized give and take society for an indefinite amount of time.
You mentioned crime. I wonder what else will be Orsi's main priority on taking office. What's top of his inbox?
I think, crime will be at the top of his invoice, but also he wants to introduce greater social justice, sustainable development, and achieve a kind of national consensus in pursuit of those things. He says he will seek to improve Uruguay's contacts and relationship with the European Union. He has tinkered, he has slightly reduced the age of retirement. And I think probably the core is going to be what it often is in many countries. Both candidates promised no increased taxes, but there is a 3% of GDP fiscal deficit. So Uruguay does need to bring its government budget back into greater equilibrium. And that is always difficult for a left-wing government, particular that has made promises about increasing social programs and reducing child poverty. So it comes back to this balancing act, really, where you try and achieve improvements in social conditions without overspending the limited amount of money you have to play with.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. That was Andrew Thompson. Now, here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. In Pakistan, tens of thousands of protesters are marching to Islamabad, demanding the release of former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Khan has urged his supporters to stay in the capital until their demands are met. A cargo plane flying on behalf of German logistics company DHL has crashed near Vilnius International Airport in Lithuania earlier today, killing one person. 3 others were injured, but their condition is unclear. And lawmakers from Georgia's ruling party have opened parliament today after last month's disputed election, despite opposition protests and a boycott. The ruling party won with 54% of the vote, but opponents say the results were fraudulent. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thanks, Laura. The G7 meets today and tomorrow outside Rome. Foreign ministers from the world's leading industrialised nations, that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States, will be joined today by ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, as well as the Secretary-General of the Arab League. High on the agenda will be the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. Well, I'm joined now by Nina dos Santos, who's an international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, many thanks for coming back on the show. How much of this meeting will be about putting guardrails in place to protect against the unpredictability of the incoming Trump administration?
Hi, Georgina. Well, this is the final sort of swan song of Italy's successful rotating presidency of the G7, and it's a foreign ministers' meeting, so it's not the highest level, if you like, but what they're going to be trying to do here is their objective is to leave the G7 stronger than it was before and to make sure that it is the forum of all forums for major liberal democracies to kind of get together and solve these big crises of the world, the ones that the world has been buffeted by, particularly in the last year, because it's not just the Ukraine war the world is dealing with, but it's also obviously since October the 7th of last year, strife in the Middle East too, which appears to be broadening. But the reality is, as you were just alluding to in your question there, the big unknown is the change of government in the United States. This whole year has been overshadowed by the most consequential election that took place just a few weeks ago. And obviously that's going to radically rewrite the agenda for the 2025 G7 meetings in the year to come. And there are also other big countries around the world that are probably going to have a change of government that are members of the G7 during that period. You know, Emmanuel Macron's future in France is looking extremely dicey. And there's probably going to be a change of government in places like Germany. So all of these countries are going to have to get together in the throes of this final G7 presidency of Italy over perhaps a glass of something strong and think about how to plan to protect those key multilateral institutions and security bodies like NATO from a future Trump presidency when he's made it very clear that he wants to do things his own way yet again, and that might mean scrapping certain alliances that are crucial to countries inside the G7.
You talk about getting together, and we know that Russia and Ukraine will be discussed, but how united is the G7 on that issue?
Well, there are some countries that are sort of pivoting, as we were saying before, away from supporting Ukraine, not least, perhaps not the Biden administration now in the United States, but in the future, obviously a future Trump administration. And when one sort of phrase in terms of its support, although the UK appears to be steadfast in its support for Ukraine, there are others that appear to be wavering. I mentioned Germany earlier. We saw the first phone call in quite some time between Olaf Scholz, the possibly outgoing German chancellor, just a few days ago, and Vladimir Putin, who had been completely ostracized until recently by the international community. But lo and behold, now the chancellor of Germany in a weak position, with his country economically weak as well because of the lack of flow of Russian cheap gas and, you know, the lack of the market in China for German cars, he suddenly is pivoting a little bit further closer towards Vladimir Putin. And it's those types of changes that people will be looking at very, very closely to see how the chessboard will be laid out for the next G7 rotating president, Canada, in 2025. There are other things on the agenda, though, of course. It's not just Ukraine, although that is the biggie in the room. Actually, if you look at the communique from the Italian government on their Ministry of Foreign Affairs website heading into these meetings, the first thing on the agenda for the Italians appears to be solving the humanitarian crisis currently unfolding in Gaza and trying to shore up peace and security in the Middle East. They also don't want, because of course they're closer, of course, to the Mediterranean basin, they don't want there to be a much bigger and more damaging conflagration in the Middle East as well. So Middle East top of the agenda, actually. the Italians, and then the war in Ukraine second.
As far as the Italians are concerned, of course, there is some internal disagreement about how they're dealing with the ICC arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yes, that's right. You're right. Italy, obviously, is a country that has a far more nuanced position when it comes to its different political parties on the Palestinian cause and also on Israel. Traditionally, there have been more left-wing governments in Italy that have traditionally had much, much stronger support for the Palestinian cause than in other European countries. And so it's no surprise that you're seeing some differences within members of the government and members of the coalition government that make up that coalition of Giorgia Meloni that have voiced different views on the direction that the International Criminal Court in The Hague has taken on deciding to, launch indictments for people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Noam Gallant, and also a now defunct leader of Hamas. Having said that, though, across the rest of Europe, there has been, the decision by the ICC to launch these proceedings against key Israeli politicians and leaders has also had quite a mixed response in other parts of the world as well.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. That's Nina dos Santos. And this is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, in Germany, the centre-left Social Democrats, the SDP, will officially nominate Chancellor Olaf Scholz as the party's lead candidate in the federal elections in February. This follows a fortnight of intense internal wrangling as party members discussed whether to back the incumbent Scholz for a second term or to choose Defence Minister Boris Pistorius. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's senior news editor, Chris Chemam. Chris, thanks for making the great trek down from your office all the way down
the stairs. Yes, it's good to be here.
Let's step back first of all, actually. Why is Scholz so unpopular?
How long do you have, Georgina? I mean, it's been a rough few years with Olaf Scholz in power. He's the head of a three-party coalition government with the Greens and the Free Democrats. And there's really a number of reasons, but I think the central one, it would be fair to say, I mean, put it this way. Simply put, he is not a particularly strong leader. That has come through both internationally and domestically. And domestically, especially, the economy is the story where Germany is struggling. It is facing recession, essentially, a mild recession, but a recession nonetheless. Essentially, Germany's economy is stagnant at the moment, has lost a number of jobs. And people do attribute that also to the government. There's been infighting within this three-party coalition for much of the time that they've been in power. That's led to reversals of policies. There was one particularly famous example of a reversal on electric cars and subsidies for that, which led to basically a collapse in demand for electric cars. They did that in order to kind of strengthen the budget, but it was a result of this kind of infighting that you've been seeing. That's really what it's come down to. Olaf Scholz has been relatively weak. He hasn't been able to hold his own coalition together internationally as well. When it comes to Ukraine, he seemed kind of wishy-washy in some of his stances, for it, then against it, for weapons and other issues around there. So just in general, not the strongest of leaders, and he is pretty historically unpopular for a German chancellor. So
it's extraordinary then that he actually prevailed in the leadership contest against the more popular Pistorius. It is, and I mean, well, there's shades of Joe Biden in the US here, I feel, not for the age reasons, but in the case of, the party essentially not wanting to challenge their own chancellor. That's really what it came down to. There was talk from the base of a switch to Boris Pistorius, who is one of the most popular German politicians at the moment. But in the end, Pistorius sort of toyed with it for a little while. He didn't speak about it. He'd let people sort of discuss him without tamping down on the speculation. But at the end of the day, he decided himself that he would not stand against the sitting German chancellor. And that's what ended it. But that said, it has been a very damaging period for the Social Democrats. So what do we make then of the opposition Christian Democrats leader, Friedrich Merz? Is he now the chancellor in waiting? Friedrich Merz is absolutely the chancellor in waiting. He currently leads, or his Christian Democrats lead the Social Democrats by about 19 points. So he's at around 33%, and the Social Democrats are way down in the doldrums. The Social Democrats may become even the fourth largest party in Germany, behind Christian Democrats, the Alternative for Germany, the far right may come second, and then the Greens and the Social Democrats will fight for that third place. But Friedrich Merz is a very known figure as well.
in German politics. He was kind of the anti-Angela Merkel, a rival to Merkel for many years. When she got the chancellorship, he stepped away from politics, and then he came back when Merkel left politics again. He's relatively conservative as it comes, far more conservative than Angela Merkel. Something of a traditional conservative, I would say. He's very pro-capitalist, pro-deregulation when it comes to the economy. He is very pro-Ukraine, pro-defense, promises to really step up Germany's military in a way that Olaf Scholz has failed. So those are some of the key policies. He has said that he will not work with the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party, even if they come in second in the elections.
But he might have to have a coalition with the Greens, perhaps.
He may have to have a coalition with the Greens or with the Social Democrats of Olaf Scholz. Those will be the two particular ones that he will be looking at. If it is the Social Democrats, expect Scholz to leave once this election is over. If it's the Greens, perhaps Scholz remains.
And briefly, Chris, I mean, would you say Germany has an effective government in the meantime? I mean, what about the budget?
It does not have a very effective government in the meantime. The government has collapsed because Olaf Scholz fired his finance minister, Christian Lindner of the Free Democrats. That in itself led to, the collapse of this government. So at the moment, he needs to rely on other parties to get anything through. And there is a question. This week, there will have to be a supplementary budget passed in order for Germany to pay its bills. It is still not entirely clear that will happen, but he is going to have to make some concessions even to Friedrich Merz and the Christian Democrats to get some support in order to get a budget through.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Chemam there. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Haaretz is Israel's oldest newspaper, and it's now been sanctioned by the government. The Israeli cabinet unanimously voted to sanction the publication, citing its critical coverage of the war and public comments by the publisher. Well, I'm joined now by Yossi Meckelberg, who's Senior Consulting Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Yossi, welcome back. How would you describe the publication, Haaretz?
Haaretz is the most liberal, progressive newspaper in Israel. It's for many, many years is critical about the occupation, the blockade on Gaza, the expansion of settlements in the West Bank. And as a result of it, they were liked by government, possibly also from the center left as well. But it's part of freedom of speech, and Israel is supposed to be a democracy. So even if someone in government doesn't like what Haaretz publishes, it's a very professional, wonderful journalist, wonderful writing, and an attack on it is trying to limit freedom of speech in Israel.
So what was the spark point that made the cabinet take action?
I think it's an ongoing issue with the media generally. In Israel, the government, especially the far-right government right now, it doesn't like that anyone criticizes it. So it tried to limit also the public broadcaster. But with Haaretz, the recent trigger was certain things that the publisher of Haaretz, Amos Shokan, said in London, actually, in the Haaretz conference. Incidentally, I was in the hall. I participated in this conference. He could have chosen his words better, but it's not a reason to impose sanction on a newspaper as a result of it, especially that many journalists criticize their own publisher on the pages of the Haaretz.
Because he called Hamas freedom fighters, is that correct?
Yes, he called it. It was, to be honest, I was sitting in the hall. I cringed a little bit. It probably was the wrong time to say, the wrong thing to say about Hamas, considering what happened in 7th of October. I think it was also clumsy. And he apologized for this. And again, it's not the question whether we agree with Amos Shokan or not. I disagree with what he said. But this is part of freedom of speech. Someone and his own journalist came in Haaretz, which shows how progressive is the newspaper, and said to Amos Shokel, "You were wrong. You should not have said that." And he apologized for this. And as far as anyone in the democratic system should have been concerned, this should have been the end of the matter.
So what's the future of the publication then? Can they survive in spite of this government sanction?
Yeah, the sanction itself means that the government won't have any commercial relation with the newspaper in terms of advertisement, and it hurts. I think the only answer for anyone that believes in freedom of speech and freedom of press is, and I'm not saying this is an advertisement, I don't get anything from it, but I think go and buy a subscription to Haaretz just in defense of a democratic system in Israel and freedom of press.
And as you say, it's a very good newspaper.
It's an excellent newspaper.
Yossi, thank you very much indeed. That was Yossi Meckelberg, who's a Senior Consulting Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. And this is The Briefing. The Prix Goncourt is the premier literary award in France, and this year it was won by a French-Algerian writer for the first time. But the author, Kamel Daoud, has gone from celebrating his victory earlier this month to defending it, as he's been accused of stealing the story from a patient being treated by his therapist wife. Well, I'm joined now by the French journalist Melissa Chemam, who's based in Paris. Melissa, many thanks for joining us on the show to explain this story to us. First of all, what is the book about?
Right. So, hello. This story is actually referring to a very dark part of Algerian history in the 90s, when the country plunged little by little into a civil war, as it's known now, between what we could refer as Islamist factions against the government and the military. And it's also a subject that is very hard to discuss in Algeria, because after that Black Decade has been nicknamed, many laws have come to foster reconciliation. And so it's not easy to address it in the public space. And that novel does directly that. It tells the story of a woman who was attacked and barely survived while her entire family was massacred. And then it deals with how she survived the trauma and how she looks back to her life, how she grows as a woman, how she finds her own passion, and how she lives with the ghost of her family.
And so what is he exactly being accused of?
So the details have been revealed recently, but actually the woman's lawyer said that they filed against Daoud over the summer because the lady who's complaining, her name is Sauda, she says that she was treated by Daoud's wife, who's a psychiatrist, and she always insisted on wanting her story to remain confidential. Sauda Arban is now 30 years old, and she said that actually Daoud, who's a public columnist and a well-known author, has been actually requesting from her to work on a script for a film or other issues where she would tell her story, and she strictly refused. So when she read the book, she totally recognized herself, and she gave a lot of details on exactly how her body has been scarred, how she lost her voice almost entirely, and also her passion for horses. She's herself now a well-known competitor. So despite her trauma and her will never to speak about her story, she decided to complain about the betrayal, but also about the case of medical confidentiality being broken.
And what does Daoud and his therapist wife say about this?
So mostly the French publisher from Daoud, Gallimard, said that this is calumny, this is the right of a writer, a novelist, to reimagine a story that would embody a real situation, in that case for Algeria, and that he's invented most of the parts. He has been pretty silent, so apart from the very strong denial from the publisher, is still in a position to kind of respond to both the family of Saada in the justice system, because there might be a case. There are two different complaints, because as I said, in Algeria, there are only very few circumstances when people can address the Black Decade publicly in a piece of writing or fiction. So it remains to be seen. There are other difficult relations between France and Algeria that pushes the writer to complain about the country entirely and to claim that he's being harassed for being too vocal about the regime.
The Prix Goncourt is huge in France. It's the premier literary award. Might he lose that prize?
He probably won't lose the prize. I don't think the prize is at stake there. And actually, as I mentioned, the lawyer even said that it didn't make the complaints public until the final announcement of the prize winner recently in November. Also, the prize is quite known. As you said, it's very important in France, and it usually generates enormous sales for the winner. But it's also very well known to be connected to big publishers. Lots of members of the big publishing house and authors that have been prized before, awarded before, are members of the jury. So there's a strong connection between the literary world, the prize, and the artists that get awarded. So it's very, very unlikely that they would turn their back on Kamel Daoud.
And just finally, I wonder how easy this is. I mean, you alluded to it earlier, but it must happen frequently that a writer hears a great story that they later incorporate into their work, knowingly or even unconsciously.
Yes, indeed. And actually, it's a very big part of French cultural scene. It's quite well known that France authorities have often defended artists that have been in similar situations. But I think in that case, it's a little bit complicated because of the tense relations between France and Algeria, and also because it's a medical complaint. If the wife the lawyer has shown evidence of correspondence, of documents that shows that Kamel Daoud's wife was her therapist and then should have been kept under secrecy, and that they broke that relationship because Kamel Daoud addressed and wrote to her directly. It's kind of a specific case where maybe the events are going very far. I think the level of violence the woman has been forced through during the war, including rape and watching her family die, is also an extreme case of personal history compared to, let's say, great French novels that have been inspired by real people. So it might be a case that get to be discussed for quite some time.
Melissa, thank you very much indeed. That was Melissa Chemam speaking to us from Paris. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.